It was early October of 2019 when I decided I needed a break from everything. I was 34 at the time, living in Denver, working as a freelance web developer, and slowly burning out. My eyes hurt from too much screen time, my sleep was a mess, and I hadn't taken a proper break in more than 2 years. So I rented a small off-grid cabin in northern Idaho, close to a lake called Lake Pend Oreille. I found it on a listing site for off-grid getaways. No power, no Wi-Fi, no cell service, just a generator if I needed it and a propane heater for the cold. I brought enough supplies for 10 days. Canned food, freeze-dried meals, water jugs, a few books, a first aid kit, batteries, flashlights, a hand crank radio, a thick sleeping bag, and a journal I hadn't written in since college. I also brought a 9mm pistol. I wasn't paranoid, but the idea of being deep in the woods alone made me feel better having it. I'd used guns growing up in Kansas, knew how to handle one, and just liked the peace of mind. The cabin was about a mile from the main gravel road, reachable by a narrow, unmaintained dirt trail that twisted through dense forest. I drove my 4Runner as far as I could, parked under a leaning pine tree, and hiked the rest with my gear in 2 trips. The air smelled like cold pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were my boots on the ground and the occasional bird rustling high above. The place was smaller than the pictures made it look, just a single room with a cot, a wood stove, a folding table, and a little kitchenette with a propane burner. There was a composting toilet in a shed out back, and a metal bin raised off the ground to keep food away from animals. No insulation to speak of, just logs and gaps sealed with old chinking. I liked it instantly. It was rough and quiet and exactly what I needed. The first few days passed in slow, pleasant rhythm. I'd wake with the sun, boil water for coffee on the burner, eat something simple, then hike around the area. I had brought some topo maps and marked out a few trails that looped through the forest. I saw deer, fresh moose tracks, and once spotted a bear's paw print in the mud near a creek. I kept my pistol on my belt whenever I wandered more than 100 yards from the cabin. By the 4th day, I'd settled into a steady groove.
I rid, I hiked, I cooked, I chopped wood.
I wasn't using the generator at all, just relying on daylight and headlamps. I felt healthier than I had in months. But that night, something changed. Started small. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up needing to piss. I grabbed my flashlight, slipped into my boots, and stepped outside. The moon was barely out, a thin white sliver in the sky, and everything else was dark. The trees loomed like black walls. I walked to the edge of the clearing, relieved myself, and turned back toward the cabin when I heard a crunch behind me. It wasn't a branch falling. It was weight, something heavy pressing down on leaves and twigs. I froze, light off, breath held. Another crunch, this time closer. I clicked on my flashlight and scanned the trees. Nothing, just trunks, shadows, and silence. I waited, listening, for maybe 2 minutes. Nothing more. I went back inside, locked the door, and lay in the cot with the pistol on my chest. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe a moose, maybe even just a tree shifting in the wind. But the feeling in my gut said otherwise. I hiked less that day, staying close to the cabin, keeping the pistol nearby. I started noticing little things I hadn't before. Scratches on the side of the food bin, bent branches on the trail I'd walked yesterday, and what looked like a piece of torn cloth snagged on a bush. It was dark green, almost camo, and looked weathered, like it had been there a while. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat inside with the lights off, listening. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it again. Footsteps. Not animal movement. Not the darting steps of a raccoon or fox. Slow, deliberate steps. 2-legged. They circled the cabin once, then again. I kept the gun in my hand, heart hammering in my chest, breath shallow. I stayed silent. Whoever it was didn't knock, didn't try the door, didn't speak. Just walked, then disappeared back into the woods. I waited until dawn before I moved again. The next day I packed. I wasn't going to stay another night. I didn't care about the money I'd already spent. I could hike out, reach my truck, and head back to Denver. But when I got to the trail, I found something that stopped me cold. Footprints. Several sets. They weren't mine. I had hiking boots with a specific tread. These were flatter, maybe work boots or old military style. They came from the woods and followed the same trail I used to hike in. I turned back to the cabin, not sure what else to do. I checked the area around the food bin and found more signs. The lid had been moved slightly and a few items were gone. A can of chili, a bag of trail mix. My stomach nodded. Someone had been watching me, maybe for days, maybe longer. I scanned the trees with my binoculars and saw nothing, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I kept the pistol in a holster on my hip now, even inside the cabin. I started sleeping during the day and staying awake at night. I didn't light fires anymore. I ate cold food. I kept the generator off, the lights off, and the windows covered. But the footsteps came back. Sometimes I'd hear them at 2 or 3 in the morning. Sometimes just after sunset. Always slow, always circling. I started to see things too, rocks stacked near the edge of the clearing, like tiny markers. A stick stuck upright in the ground with a strip of cloth tied to the top. A fresh boot print in the mud near the outhouse. The worst part was the silence. Whoever it was, they never spoke, never made noise besides those slow steps. They never approached while I was outside, never made a sound during the day. I started to lose track of time. I marked each day in my journal with a slash, but I couldn't remember if I had been there 7 days or 9 or 10. The sky stayed gray, the forest cold and wet. On what I guessed was the 9th day, I found something that broke me a little. I had a solar-powered trail cam I set up near one of the game trails for fun, just to see what passed by at night. I hadn't checked it in a few days, so I took it inside and scrolled through the photos. At first it was normal: deer, a raccoon, a squirrel. Then one frame showed a man, mid-30s, maybe 40s, scruffy beard, dark clothes, heavy jacket, no pack, just standing, half turned away from the camera. The timestamp was from 3 nights ago, around 3:18 a.m. I stared at that photo for an hour. I didn't recognize him. He looked thin, worn down, like someone who'd lived rough for a long time. His eyes were just barely visible in the image, and they looked blank, like there was nothing behind them, just emptiness. I deleted the photo and took the SD card out of the cam. I smashed the camera with a rock. That night I stayed up again, pistol in hand, back to the wall, facing the door. Around 2:40 a.m., I heard the first step, then another, closer. They circled the cabin once, then stopped. Dead silence. 10 minutes passed. Then I heard the doorknob rattle. Not hard, not aggressive, just enough to test it. I raised the gun, breath locked in my throat. I didn't move. The knob stopped. Then footsteps again, fading. I didn't sleep at all. The next day, I made my decision. I packed everything I could carry and left the rest. I had to get out now. I hiked to my truck as fast as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder. When I reached the vehicle, I found something that made me freeze again. The driver's side mirror had been pushed in. It didn't break, just folded like someone had walked by and bumped it. There were fresh muddy prints by the door. I unlocked it, got in, and drove out fast. The whole way down the dirt road, I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone step out into the trail behind me. I never did. I drove straight to Sandpoint and rented a cheap motel room. I stayed 2 nights, showered 3 times, slept with the lights on, and kept the gun on the nightstand. I didn't go back to Denver right away. I just needed to feel normal again. I looked up missing persons reports in the area. There were a few, mostly hikers or campers who never came back, but nothing recent. Nothing I could link to what happened. I filed a report with the local sheriff's office, told them someone might be living out there, possibly stealing food, maybe watching cabins. They took notes, thanked me, and that was it. I never heard back from them. I never went back to Idaho. I never even finished the journal entries. I threw the whole thing out when I got home. Sometimes I still think about that man in the trail cam photo, his face, his eyes. I don't think he wanted to hurt me. If he did, he had plenty of chances. I think he just wanted to scare me, or maybe warn me, or maybe that's just what I tell myself so I can sleep at night. I still go camping sometimes, but never alone, never off-grid, never without cell service. And I always park where I can see the road. Always. I took a week off in early October of 2017 to clear my head. I had just turned 35, recently gone through a breakup, and I needed some time away from everything. I booked a small, off-grid cabin in northern Idaho, a few miles outside a small town called Bonner's Ferry. It was one of those listings that didn't show up on most travel sites, and I found it by chance through a forum where people shared quiet, remote getaways. The owner emailed me a PDF with directions, said there was no cell service and no Wi-Fi, and advised bringing enough supplies since the nearest store was about 45 minutes away. That was exactly what I wanted. No noise, no people, no distractions. Just me, some paperbacks, a fishing rod, a bunch of canned food, and some good boots. The cabin was deep in the forest, about a mile off a gravel road that wound through a dense stretch of pine and birch. I had to leave my car at a clearing and hike the rest of the way in with my backpack. The trail was narrow and covered with damp leaves. It felt like I was walking through a tunnel made of trees. The air was cold, but not freezing, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots and the wind brushing through the branches. When I reached the cabin, it looked exactly like the pictures. One story, dark brown wood siding, a steep roof, a small porch with a couple of chairs, and a metal chimney poking out the top. No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove, a couple of oil lanterns, a hand pump for water out back, and a composting toilet in a shed a few feet away. It smelled faintly of old wood and pine smoke. I liked it immediately. The first few days went by peacefully. I spent mornings fishing at a nearby creek, afternoons reading on the porch, and evenings watching the fire inside the stove flicker and glow. There was a calm that I hadn't felt in a long time. I didn't think about work, my ex, or anything else. I just let myself sink into the rhythm of the place. The woods felt safe at first. Everything was quiet. A few squirrels, some birds, a couple of deer passing through the brush. Once I even saw a fox trotting along the edge of the tree line, completely unaware of me. There were no strange noises, no signs of people, no litter or trails aside from the one I'd used to get in. It was isolated but peaceful. The first odd thing I noticed happened on the fourth night. I was in bed, the fire dying down in the stove, and I heard something out in the woods. It wasn't a loud sound, just a single, deliberate crunch of dry leaves. Not the rustling of a deer or the fluttering of wings. It sounded like a boot stepping on the ground. Just one step, then nothing. I sat up in bed and listened for a long time. The fire crackled softly, and the wind moaned against the cabin walls. But I didn't hear the sound again. I told myself it could have been anything. Maybe a tree limb falling. Maybe an animal stepped on something hard. I didn't want to let my imagination start spinning. The next morning, I walked around the cabin. I didn't see anything unusual. No tracks, no broken branches, no signs that anyone had been there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me. The air felt heavier, like the trees had closed in just a little more overnight. I brushed it off and went back to my routine. I hiked a little farther than usual that day, looking for a spot I'd seen on a topographic map where two small creeks crossed. It was a quiet, beautiful place, and I sat there for a while with my feet in the water, just listening to the stream. I didn't want to rush back to the cabin. When I did get back late that afternoon, I noticed something strange. One of the chairs on the porch had been moved. I always pushed them against the wall when I wasn't using them, and now one of them was turned outward, facing the woods. I stopped walking and just stared at it for a while. There was no wind strong enough to do that, and I was sure no animals could have moved it like that. I went around the cabin again, checked all the windows and looked for footprints. The ground was mostly pine needles and moss, so it was hard to tell. I didn't see anything that screamed someone was here, but I also knew I hadn't left the chair that way. That night, I made sure the door was locked. The cabin had a heavy bolt, and I slid it shut before blowing out the lantern. I kept the hatchet I used for chopping wood next to the bed, just in case. I didn't really think I'd need it, but it made me feel better. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound on the porch. It was soft, like someone trying not to be heard. A creak of wood under slow, deliberate steps. I didn't move. I just lay there, holding my breath, staring at the ceiling. The steps moved toward the door, paused, then walked slowly along the side of the cabin toward the back. I couldn't see anything from where I was lying, and I wasn't about to light the lantern or open the door. After a few minutes, the sounds faded away. I didn't sleep much after that. I kept listening for any other noise. I imagined someone circling the cabin again and again, waiting. The woods no longer felt quiet, they felt dead. Like everything had gone still to avoid being seen. At sunrise, I went outside and looked around. No signs of anyone. The chair was still turned toward the woods. I checked the hand pump, the toilet shed, even walked a little way into the trees. Nothing. I kept telling myself it had to be an animal. A raccoon, maybe. A bear sniffing around. Something explainable. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I thought about leaving that day, but I had 2 more nights left, and I convinced myself I was just being paranoid, that I was letting my mind wander too much after being alone so long. Still, I kept the hatchet with me wherever I went, even when I just went to the toilet or fetched water. That afternoon, I stayed close to the cabin. I didn't hike or fish. I sat on the porch with a thermos of coffee and a book, trying to keep my eyes on the tree line. I scanned every movement, every rustle of wind or flash of bird wings. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't relax. As the sun dropped, I stacked more wood by the stove, lit the lanterns early, and double-checked the locks. I didn't even undress when I went to bed. I kept my boots on, just in case I had to get out quickly. I lay in the dark, heart pounding, staring at the ceiling, listening. This time, the sound didn't come from the porch. Came from the back of the cabin. A slow, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled through leaves and dirt. Then a soft knock on the back wall. Just once. Then again. I sat up slowly, reached for the hatchet, and listened. The knocking stopped. I waited. Minutes passed. Nothing. Then a third knock, farther away now, like whoever or whatever it was had moved off into the woods. To first light, I packed my things. I was supposed to check out the next morning, but I didn't care. I shoved everything into my pack, made sure the fire was out, and left without even cleaning the dishes I'd used. The trail back to the car felt different. I kept looking over my shoulder, certain I'd see someone following me, just behind the bend in the trail. When I reached the clearing where I'd parked, the car was still there. Nothing broken, nothing taken, but I noticed something that stopped me cold. On the hood, written in dirt with a finger, was a single word. Stay. It hadn't been there when I parked. I know that for a fact. I always noticed the dust on my car, especially since I'd driven over those gravel roads. Someone had been there. Someone had come all the way out into the woods, found my car, and left that message. I unlocked the door, threw my backpack in, and drove away as fast as I could without skidding off the road. I didn't stop until I reached the town, and even then, I kept checking the rearview mirror like some lunatic. I filled up with gas, grabbed coffee, and kept driving south until I hit Spokane. I checked into a hotel that night, turned on every light, and barely slept. I never went back to that cabin. I never even contacted the owner. I deleted the emails, blocked the listing site, and moved on. I didn't tell anyone the full story for a long time because I didn't want to sound insane. I still don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I think about it often. The footsteps, the knocked wall, the chair turned toward the trees, that word on the hood. They weren't trying to scare me away. They wanted me to stay. It was late September in 2016 when I decided to spend a week alone in a cabin deep in the woods of northern Vermont. I was 32 back then, living in Burlington, working as a freelance web developer, and I had reached a point where I just needed some time away from screens, notifications, and the pressure of meeting deadlines. A friend of mine had inherited an old cabin from his uncle, and he wasn't using it much. He told me I could use it for as long as I wanted, as long as I was okay with it being isolated and kind of run down. I liked the sound of that. I needed quiet and I needed space. The cabin was in a heavily forested area near a place called Jay Peak. Not right on the mountain, but tucked about 8 miles away from the nearest paved road. I drove my Subaru up through gravel roads and eventually reached the narrow dirt path that led to the cabin. Trees grew thick on both sides. There were no other cabins nearby, just forest, hills, and silence. When I finally reached the place, it looked exactly as he had described. Weathered wood siding, moss growing around the base, a slanted roof with some missing shingles. But it stood solid, and when I stepped inside, I could tell it hadn't been used in a while, but it wasn't falling apart. There was a small kitchen, a main living area with a wood stove, a table, and an old couch, and a narrow hallway that led to a single bedroom and a bathroom that didn't work anymore. The place didn't have running water or electricity, but it did have a generator outside. My friend warned me that the generator worked, but it was old and ate fuel fast. I brought my own supplies: canned food, bottled water, a camping stove, fuel, lanterns, extra batteries, a few changes of clothes, and my sleeping bag. I didn't plan to use the generator unless I really needed to. I liked the idea of staying off the grid. I turned off my phone after I sent a quick message to my brother letting him know I'd be out of touch for a while. The first couple of days were exactly what I needed. The weather was cool but clear. The air smelled like pine and wet leaves. I spent my time reading, hiking short trails, and just sitting on the porch with a cup of instant coffee in the morning. I'd hear the wind brushing through the trees, the occasional woodpecker hammering into a trunk, and at night, crickets and the distant howls of coyotes. I brought a small notepad and started sketching out some ideas for a new project. I felt better than I had in months. By the third night, things started to shift a little. It rained most of that day, not hard but steady, and the temperature dropped more than I expected. I stayed inside, playing cards with myself and writing. Around 9 or 10 that night, I heard what sounded like someone walking on the leaves outside. I figured it was just a deer or some other animal. I turned off my lantern early and climbed into my sleeping bag, listening to the soft thuds of drops hitting the roof and the faint crunching of leaves outside that came and went. The next morning, I stepped outside and saw footprints in the mud around the cabin. They weren't made by an animal. They were clearly human. I could see the treads of boots, and from the size and shape, it looked like they belonged to a man. The tracks came from the woods and circled around the back of the cabin before disappearing into the trees. I stood there for a while, trying to think rationally. Maybe a hiker got lost. Maybe a hunter was passing through. It's not illegal to be out here, even if it is private land. I told myself not to overthink it. Still, the idea that someone had walked around the cabin in the middle of the night unsettled me. I kept my pocket knife with me that day. I didn't go hiking. I stayed close, occasionally glancing toward the treeline. Nothing happened that day or that night. I didn't hear any more sounds outside. I tried to shake it off. The next morning, I went to grab some firewood I had stacked under the overhang out back, and I noticed the wood was scattered. Some of the smaller logs had rolled down the slope behind the cabin. Someone had kicked them or moved them, maybe even tried to carry some away. I could see a few fresh scuff marks in the dirt that hadn't been there before. That was the first time I felt a real wave of anxiety. Someone had definitely been close to the cabin again. I checked inside and made sure everything was where I left it. Nothing was missing, but the fact that someone had come that close without making themselves known bothered me. I thought about packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to feel like I'd been scared off. I figured I'd stay one more night, maybe two, then head home early. I didn't sleep well that night. Every sound outside felt sharper. I heard the wind pushing through the trees and branches creaking, but I kept thinking I was hearing something else, quieter, like footsteps or breathing just beyond the walls. I kept my knife close, and I barely closed my eyes. In the morning, I found more footprints near the porch, and this time I noticed something else. One of the windows, one I hadn't touched since arriving, was slightly open. It was a small window in the kitchen. It didn't open easily, and it made a sound when moved, which I definitely would have remembered. I stared at it for a long time, trying to understand how it could be open. There was no way the wind had done it. I checked the lockbox I had put outside with the spare keys and saw that it had been pried open and left empty. That's when I knew for sure someone was deliberately messing with me. I didn't feel like I was just being watched. I felt like someone was preparing for something. I packed my things quickly, loading them into my car. I didn't hear anything in the woods while I worked, but I kept glancing over my shoulder. I had the clear sense that someone was nearby, just out of sight, waiting. I tried to start the car, but nothing happened. The engine didn't even turn over. I checked under the hood, and at first, everything looked fine. But then I noticed the battery cables had been pulled loose. Not just disconnected, yanked out with the connectors bent slightly. That wasn't something that would have happened by itself. Someone had done it deliberately. I reconnected the cables as best I could, my hands shaking. When I tried again, the engine started up. I didn't waste time. I reversed out of the dirt lot, kicked up gravel, and drove back down the winding path without stopping. I didn't even look in the rearview mirror. I drove until I hit the paved road again, then kept going until I reached a small town with a gas station and a diner. I sat in the parking lot for a while, just breathing. It wasn't until I had cell service again that I turned my phone back on. I had no new messages, nothing urgent, but it felt good just to be connected again. I told my brother everything later that night. We agreed not to tell my friend what had happened. He lived in another state and rarely came up to Vermont anyway, and I didn't want to scare him or make it seem like I couldn't handle a few nights alone. A few weeks later, my friend called to say he had gone up to check on the cabin. He said the place looked fine, except the lockbox was broken and there were boot prints all around the back porch. He asked if I had done that. I told him I might have dropped the box or something while I was there, trying not to make a big deal out of it. He said he'd install a camera next time he was up there. I don't think he ever did. I still think about that week sometimes. I don't know who was out there, what they wanted, or how long they had been watching. But I know I wasn't imagining it. Someone had come close, too close, and they hadn't wanted to be seen. They waited until I was asleep. They crept around the cabin. They touched the windows, opened the lockbox, scattered the wood pile, and sabotaged the car. They knew I was there. They watched me. They made sure I knew they were there without ever showing themselves. That's what gets to me the most. I haven't been back to that cabin since. I've gone hiking and camping in other places, but never alone, and never in a cabin that far out. I learned that even in places that feel quiet and peaceful, people can still be out there, watching, waiting, just beyond the trees. Not every threat has to be loud or violent. Sometimes it just waits, quiet, patient, close. It was the fall of 2018 when I decided to take a break from everything. I was 37 then, working a stressful job as a regional maintenance coordinator for a logistics company in eastern Pennsylvania. I lived alone, barely saw my family, didn't have a lot of close friends anymore, and I could feel my mind slipping into that fog that comes before burnout. So I put in for a week off, packed up my old Tacoma with food, firewood, and the basics, and drove out to a cabin I had found on a listing site. It was located near the Allegheny National Forest, about 3 hours northwest from where I lived. I wanted quiet. I wanted no phone signal. I wanted to be away from people. The cabin was advertised as off-grid, which I liked. I didn't want luxury. I wanted silence, trees, and no interruptions. When I got there, I was surprised by how remote it really was. The gravel road that took me there wound off the main road for over 2 miles, dipping through the woods and climbing small hills. No signs, no fences, just raw forest. The cabin was a single-level structure made of aging pine logs, perched on a small clearing about 30 yards wide, surrounded on all sides by tall trees that blocked out most of the afternoon sun. It had no electricity, just a wood stove, a propane lamp mounted to the wall, and a small generator out back that powered the water pump for the sink and the small toilet inside. I arrived just before sunset. The last bit of orange light slanted through the trees as I unpacked the cooler, the sleeping bag, the portable battery for my flashlight, and a box of books I had been meaning to read. I brought a notebook too. I thought I might write something, maybe just journal, maybe just clear my head. The air was cold, already dropping into the 40s even though it was only early October, and there was a smell of dry leaves and wet bark all around. I lit the propane lamp and started a small fire in the wood stove. It felt good in there, the heat soaking slowly into the floorboards, the air getting thick with the scent of pine smoke. The first night was peaceful. I slept early, maybe around 9. No sounds but the occasional pop of the stove or a soft creak from the old wood frame. I woke once, maybe at 2 or 3 in the morning, and stepped out to take a leak. The night was pitch black. I couldn't even see the tree line from the porch. My flashlight barely touched the dark. I remember thinking how strange it felt to be so cut off. Not scary, just heavy, like the woods had swallowed everything. The next day, I walked some of the surrounding trails. There were no marked paths, but the undergrowth wasn't too thick. I followed deer tracks, looked at trees, kicked through leaf piles, and just let my mind drift. I didn't see a single person or hear a single sound besides birds and wind. Around noon, I ate by the fire pit outside the cabin, then spent the afternoon reading a book I found at a garage sale a year earlier. I hadn't realized how much I needed that stillness until I felt it. No pressure to check email. No one expecting anything from me. That night, I noticed something odd. I was inside, cooking a can of chili on the stove. I had just taken off my boots and was sitting by the fire, eating, when I heard something outside. It wasn't loud. It was soft, actually, like something brushing lightly against the porch steps. I paused, held my breath for a moment, and listened. Nothing. Total silence again. I figured it was an animal. Raccoons, maybe, or deer. The woods were full of them. I walked to the door, opened it slowly, and looked out. Nothing but shadows and trees. My flashlight beam scanned the clearing. No eyes, no movement, no sound. I closed the door, locked it, and went back to finish my food. I didn't sleep as well that night, not because I was scared, but because I kept half waking from small sounds. Not loud bangs, not howls, just light scratches, faint crunches of dry leaves, occasional dull thuds that sounded too spaced out to be an animal moving quickly. Every time I sat up and listened, the sound stopped. By morning, I was tired. I made coffee over the stove, sat out on the porch, and watched the sunlight spill in through the trees. The uneasiness I felt overnight started to wear off. I reminded myself it was probably a raccoon or even a porcupine or possum. They move strangely, make weird noises, nothing to worry about. But later that morning, I noticed something that stuck with me. I had walked about half a mile from the cabin to look at a section of pine forest with thicker tree coverage. I was kneeling down to inspect some old boot prints in the dirt. They didn't look fresh, but they were shaped like hiking boots. I thought maybe the cabin owner came out here often. As I turned to head back, I saw a plastic water bottle resting at the base of a tree. It was dented, dirty, but still had some water in it. Not mine. I hadn't brought disposable bottles. I carried a canteen. Then, as I walked back along the same rough path, I saw something else. A broken branch on a tree about 7 feet up, snapped clean. Below it, a piece of red fabric caught on the bark. Faded, torn, like from a jacket or flannel shirt. No blood or anything, but it looked like it had been there for a few weeks. That stopped me in my tracks. I kept glancing over my shoulder the rest of the way back. That night, it was colder. I had started stacking wood beside the stove early. I kept the propane lamp on longer than usual, letting the shadows stay off the walls. I also kept the flashlight on my lap while I sat in the chair watching the fire. I didn't want to admit that I was nervous, but I felt like I was being stupid by not being more cautious. I had no cell signal.
No neighbors.
And I had seen clear signs someone else had been out there recently. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound. It was the sound of someone or something moving across the porch. Heavy, slow footsteps, not like a raccoon, not a deer, sounded like boots. I froze in the sleeping bag. My flashlight was under the pillow. I grabbed it slowly and turned it on. The footsteps stopped. I waited a full 5 minutes before unzipping the sleeping bag and standing. The fire had gone out. The lamp was off. I moved toward the door and listened. Nothing, just the wind brushing the side of the cabin. Then I looked through the small square window beside the door. First, I saw nothing, but then I noticed something very subtle. There were boot prints on the porch, clear in the thin layer of dust and leaves. I hadn't made them. I hadn't stepped outside since late afternoon. My boots were inside, still drying from my earlier walk. The prints led toward the side of the cabin, then disappeared off the porch. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. I walked slowly, scanning every tree, every branch. I found no one, no more footprints. But about 30 feet into the woods, I found something that shook me worse than the prints. A fire ring, recently used, still smelled like ash and smoke. There were 3 beer cans crushed in a pile, a plastic wrapper from some kind of snack, and a partially buried metal fork. It wasn't far from the cabin. Someone had been camping there, watching. I walked straight back and started packing. I didn't care if I still had 3 days left. I didn't feel safe. It wasn't a ghost or a monster. It was just someone. Some person living out there or hiding or squatting. That was worse. People are worse. I tossed everything back into the truck, checked under the cabin, checked the generator shed, locked the cabin behind me, and got in. The road out felt longer than it had coming in. Every tree felt like it was hiding someone. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out behind me. I never reported it to anyone. I never told the owner. I left a review that just said, "Cabin was peaceful but too remote for my comfort." That was it. I didn't want to be dramatic or bring trouble. I just wanted to forget it. But weeks later, I was watching the news, and I saw something that made my stomach sink. A man had been arrested in the Allegheny National Forest area. He had been wanted for theft and suspected of several disappearances. They caught him living in a makeshift campsite less than a mile from a cabin rental area. They showed photos of his camp. Same beer cans, same brand, same exact red flannel caught on a tree behind the site. I didn't say anything. I just turned off the TV and sat there for a long time. I think about that trip more often than I'd like to admit. I think about what would have happened if I'd stayed, if I hadn't trusted my instincts. Sometimes, I still wake up in the night, thinking I hear someone walking outside. But when I open my eyes, I'm back in my apartment, back where there are streetlights, sirens, voices behind the walls. I don't think I'll ever go that deep into the woods alone again. Not because of what I saw, but because of what I didn't. It was the fall of 2018 when I decided I needed to get away from everything for a while. I was 32 at the time, working a job I didn't love in Indianapolis, living alone in a small apartment just outside the city. Life had started to feel like one long blur of traffic, emails, and silent dinners. I wasn't depressed or anything, but I felt tired all the time, like I had been walking in circles for months without noticing it. I wanted quiet. I wanted to feel something different. So, I rented a small cabin up in Michigan, in a remote area near the Manistee National Forest. The place had no internet, no phone reception, and barely any sign of other people. It was a simple wooden structure with a sloped green metal roof, a small front porch, and a single chimney sticking out of the top. Inside, it was just one big room with a wood stove, a small kitchenette, and a bed pushed against the far wall. There was a separate bathroom with a composting toilet and a small shower, but that was it. I brought a few books, some basic groceries, a camping knife, and enough bottled water to last the week. The cabin came with firewood and propane, so I figured I'd be fine. The first day was quiet. I arrived just after lunch, parked the car behind the cabin where the dirt road ended, and carried my stuff inside. The forest was already deep into fall colors. Yellows, reds, and browns all around me, and the air smelled like dry leaves and cold soil. It was peaceful, and I liked that. I spent the afternoon walking down a trail behind the cabin, just exploring. I didn't go far. Maybe half a mile down, I found a small stream and some animal tracks, probably deer, and then turned back. That night, I made a fire, ate a can of chili, and went to bed early. I didn't even check my watch. The second day, I woke up before the sun rose. The cabin was cold, so I lit a fire and wrapped myself in a blanket while I made oatmeal on the gas burner. Outside, everything was still. No cars, no planes, no human sounds at all. Just the wind in the trees and a few birds. It was strange how fast I had adjusted to the silence. I spent most of the day reading, then chopped a bit of wood with the hatchet I found near the firewood pile. Around 5 in the evening, I noticed something strange. Near the edge of the tree line, maybe 20 yards from the porch, there was a small patch of earth that looked like it had been disturbed. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a slightly raised area of dirt, darker than the ground around it. I figured maybe an animal had dug something up, or maybe the ground was softer there. I didn't think much of it. That night, as I sat on the porch with a mug of hot water in my hands, I noticed the forest was quieter than it had been the night before. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just dead silence, like the woods had shut themselves off. I stayed out for another 10 minutes before going inside and locking the door, even though I hadn't bothered the night before. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a thud. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp, like something hitting the wall outside. I sat up in bed and waited, listening. There were no footsteps, no voices, just that single thud and then silence. I didn't move. I just sat there under the covers, wide awake, waiting for another sound. None came. Eventually, after about an hour, I fell asleep again. The next morning, I went outside and looked around. Nothing was out of place. I walked around the cabin, checking the walls. On the backside, near the base of the wall under the bedroom window, there was a small dent in the wood, like something heavy had struck it. Not enough to do real damage, but enough to mark it. It wasn't there when I arrived, I was sure of that. I stood there staring at it for a while, then walked over to the tree line and looked around. Nothing. No tracks, no signs of animals. Just silence and leaves. Later that day, I took the same trail I had walked on the first day. I figured some movement would help me shake the weird feeling I had. I passed the same stream, followed the same path, but this time I kept going a little farther. Maybe another half-mile in, I found something odd. There was a small clearing just off the trail, and in the middle of it, someone had built a fire pit. Not a casual one, either. It was surrounded by stones in a neat circle, with old ashes in the middle and pieces of charred wood. I hadn't seen any smoke, and the ashes were cold, but the pit didn't look abandoned. The wood looked too fresh. I looked around for any sign of people, maybe a tent, a trail camera, a tarp, anything, but the clearing was empty. I stayed there for a few minutes, then headed back to the cabin. I didn't like the feeling in my gut. Something about that fire pit didn't sit right with me. That night, I locked the door again and made sure all the windows were shut tight. I kept the hatchet near the bed and tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid. I stayed up late reading, trying to distract myself, but around midnight, I heard something again. This time it was softer, like someone walking on dry leaves. I got out of bed and turned off the lantern. I stood there in the dark, listening. The sound came from the back of the cabin again. Slow steps, like someone trying not to be heard. Then it stopped. I waited maybe 5 minutes, then moved quietly to the window and looked out. I couldn't see anything, just the trees and the faint outline of the trail in the moonlight. Still, I didn't go back to sleep. I stayed up the whole night, sitting in the chair by the stove with the hatchet in my hand. When the sun finally came up, I went outside right away. I walked around the cabin again and found more marks near the back. Footprints this time. Not boot prints, bare feet. I'm not an expert, but they looked like adult feet, wide and flat, with deep impressions in the soft ground. The steps came out of the woods, circled the cabin, and then went back into the trees. I followed them a short way, maybe 30 feet, before they disappeared into the leaves and underbrush. That day, I packed my things and loaded them into the car, but I didn't leave. I wanted to, badly, but something stopped me. Pride, maybe, or just stubbornness. I told myself I'd stay one more night, then leave first thing in the morning. No more walks, no more exploring. Just one more night. I kept the hatchet even closer that evening, and I blocked the front door with a chair. I kept a flashlight in my hand, and I turned off all the lights inside. I sat there in the dark, listening. Around midnight, I heard the steps again. This time, they came around the front, slow and steady. I moved to the front window and peeked through a crack in the curtain. I didn't see anything at first, just the porch and the trees beyond. Then I noticed a shape move between two trees, low and slow. It wasn't an animal. It was a person, crouched low, moving sideways like they were trying to stay hidden. I ducked down, heart racing. Whoever it was, they didn't come closer. After about 10 minutes, the sound stopped again. I stayed on the floor for an hour before I dared to move. I didn't sleep at all that night. At sunrise, I got in the car and drove out fast. The dirt road was narrow and rough, but I didn't care. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station almost 40 miles south. I went inside, used the bathroom, and stood in front of the coffee machine shaking so hard I could barely hold a cup. I didn't talk to anyone. I just got in the car and kept driving until I made it back to Indianapolis. Later that week, I called the rental company and told them something strange had happened at the cabin. I didn't go into detail. They just said they'd look into it. I never heard back. A few months later, I tried to find the listing online again, but it was gone. Maybe they took it down, maybe someone else bought it. I didn't care. I never went back. I still think about that place sometimes. About the tracks, the fire pit, the sound of footsteps in the leaves. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. Maybe it was just some local living off-grid, or someone messing with me for fun. But there was something about the way they moved, how careful they were, how quiet they stayed. Felt like it wasn't random. Felt like they had done it before. But the part that really gets to me, the part one still remember in the middle of the night, is what I found weeks later when I finally unpacked the last of my stuff. In the bottom of my duffel bag, buried under a sweatshirt, was a small piece of twine. Not mine. I don't carry twine. It was rough, homemade, and tied into a loop. I don't know how it got there. I don't know when. Maybe it meant nothing. But I haven't gone back to the woods since. And I don't think I ever will. I was 31 when I decided to rent a cabin up north by myself for a week. It was October 2022. I just finished a rough year at work. Long hours, barely any breaks, and a promotion that came with more stress than pay. I lived in Des Moines, and the cabin was in northern Minnesota, near a place called Toft, just off a winding gravel road that curved into Superior National Forest. I'd found the place on a rental site, not fancy, just old pine logs, a pitched roof, and a porch that faced the trees. There was no cell signal up there, and that was the point. I wanted to disconnect, sleep in, go for hikes, maybe read something that wasn't work-related. I packed a few books, canned food, instant coffee, some tools just in case, and drove up on a chilly Sunday morning. It was colder than I expected. The leaves were already past peak color, and most of them were on the ground. It rained off and on during the drive, but when I got to the cabin around 5 p.m., it was clear. The place looked just like the photos, small, quiet, nestled in thick trees that blocked most of the fading daylight. There was a gravel spot to park and a little path leading to the front door. Inside, it smelled faintly like old wood and dust. The cabin had one main room with a bed in the corner, a kitchenette, a little cast iron stove for heat, and a separate bathroom with a toilet and a small shower. There were windows on 3 sides, though most were small and high up. A few had blinds, some didn't. The first night was uneventful. I made a simple dinner, read for a while, and went to bed early. It was so quiet I couldn't sleep at first. No cars, no humming appliances, no city noise. Just wind in the trees and the occasional creak from the cabin's frame. I woke up a few times to drink water or use the bathroom, but eventually fell into a deeper sleep. When I woke up the next morning, it was around 9. The sun was filtering through the trees, and I could hear the wind again. I had breakfast, did some stretching, and then went for a walk along the old forest road. There was no one else around. I didn't see any cabins nearby, no signs of recent vehicle tracks. I walked for about an hour, passed a few overgrown paths leading into the woods, and turned around. Felt good being disconnected. I made a late lunch and spent the afternoon reading outside in a camp chair I'd brought. That night, it got colder. I lit the wood stove and kept it going as I made soup and boiled some tea water. I went to bed early again. That's when things started to feel off. I woke up around 2:30 a.m. to a loud snap outside. It sounded like a branch breaking. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer stepping on something. Then I heard the crunch of gravel near the driveway. My body froze. It wasn't fast or heavy, but it wasn't quiet either. Like someone walking slowly, maybe in boots. I got up as quietly as I could and looked out the window, pulling the blind to the side just enough to peek through. I couldn't see anything at first. The moon was bright enough to light the clearing in front of the cabin, and nothing moved out there. I stood there for a long time, listening. Eventually, I told myself it had to be an animal and went back to bed, but I didn't sleep much after that. The next day, I checked outside. Nothing looked disturbed. No tracks, no broken branches, just leaves and gravel. I walked down the road again, this time farther, to clear my head, but the whole time, I had the feeling I was being watched. Every time the trees rustled, I'd stop and turn. Nothing. No birds, no squirrels, no wind strong enough to explain the movement. I kept walking, trying not to let my mind wander too far into paranoia. That evening, I brought more wood inside, made dinner, and tried to relax. I locked the door, checked the windows, and kept the stove going. Around 10, I killed the lights and got into bed. I lay there for a long time listening. It was quieter than the first 2 nights. No wind, no branches moving, no distant owl calls, just silence. And then, around 3 a.m., the crunching came back. This time, it was closer, more deliberate, like someone circling the cabin. I sat up and listened hard, barely breathing. There were slow steps on the gravel, then on the dead leaves, then silence. A minute later, I heard what sounded like a soft tap against one of the walls, then nothing again. I wanted to believe it was a tree limb falling or some animal scratching, but it didn't sound like that. It sounded like fingers. I stayed in bed, heart pounding, holding my breath for long stretches. I didn't dare look out the window this time. I just waited. After maybe 20 minutes, I heard the sound fade away. I stayed awake until daylight. That morning, I walked around the cabin again. Still nothing obvious. No tracks, no scuffs on the walls, no signs of animals digging or scratching. I told myself I was overthinking it, maybe dreaming it, but part of me knew better. I considered leaving early. It wasn't like I had to stay the whole week, but it also felt dumb to run from something that might not even be real. I told myself I'd give it one more night. If anything else happened, I'd leave the next morning. That afternoon, I kept busy. I chopped some firewood, went for a short hike with a small hatchet clipped to my belt, and made an early dinner. I pulled the blinds tight on every window that had them and pushed furniture in front of the 2 that didn't. Before dark, I locked the door and brought my hatchet inside. I didn't light the stove that night. I didn't want to cast flickering shadows on the windows. I just wore layers and stayed in bed with the covers up, hatchet within reach. I didn't sleep. I just lay there in the dark, eyes open, ears straining. Around 1 a.m., I heard it again. This time, it was more than just footsteps. There was a dragging sound, like something being pulled through the leaves. Then a soft thud, like something being set down on the porch. I held the hatchet tight and waited. Then came the slow creak of the porch boards. 1, 2, 3 steps. Then it stopped. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. My heart felt like it would burst out of my chest. A few minutes passed. Then I heard the faintest scraping sound, like a fingernail or a piece of metal against the doorframe. Then nothing. I stayed frozen until the sky began to lighten. The sounds never came back. At first light, I got up, packed my gear, and shoved everything into the car. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just drove, not stopping until I hit Duluth. Back home, I kept thinking about it. I couldn't prove anything had happened. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear a vehicle. No doors were tampered with. But I knew I wasn't alone out there. Someone had been watching me. A few weeks later, I looked up the cabin listing again. It was gone. I searched the name of the owner from my booking receipt, but nothing came up. It was like the place had vanished. I checked online forums, rental reviews, even satellite maps of the area. Nothing showed the cabin I stayed in. I wasn't even sure what road I'd taken to get there anymore. Most of the forest roads didn't have names, and GPS hadn't worked. I still have the photos I took, just a few of the trees and the stove and one blurry shot of the porch. They don't prove much. I showed a couple of friends, but I never told them the full story. They'd think I imagined it, and maybe part of me wanted to believe that too. But I didn't imagine the sound of those steps. or the dragging, or the scrape on the doorframe. I know what I heard. I know I wasn't dreaming. I haven't gone camping since. Haven't stayed in another cabin, even with friends. I don't plan to. Some things aren't worth the risk. Out there in the woods, miles from the nearest help, you're just another part of the silence. And sometimes the silence is listening. It was October of 2018 when I decided to spend a long weekend alone at a cabin I had rented deep in the woods of northern Vermont. I was 36 years old then, working a job that drained every bit of energy I had during the week. The city had become loud in ways I hadn't noticed before. People were always rushing, and the sound of traffic and construction had started to feel like nails on a chalkboard. I needed silence. I needed to be alone somewhere quiet, somewhere far from everything. So, when I found this small listing online for a secluded cabin near a place called Alder Creek, it felt like a perfect idea. No neighbors for miles, no cell service, no internet. It was exactly what I wanted. The drive up took me nearly 6 hours. The last part of it was nothing but dirt road that twisted through thick trees. Leaves had turned deep red and orange, and they fell constantly onto the road like confetti. I kept the windows up because the cold air cut sharp even during the day. I remember thinking how peaceful it all looked. Sunlight pushing through branches, no other cars in sight, not even a mailbox. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin sat, it was already late afternoon. The place was smaller than I imagined, but clean and sturdy, with siding, tin roof, a stone chimney. There was a little shed about 20 feet off to the side, half hidden behind trees, and a narrow path that led down toward the sound of running water. Inside, the cabin was simple. A twin bed, a small wooden table, a chair, and a cast iron stove. No power, but there were a few lanterns hanging on hooks, a pile of chopped wood, and a hand pump for water at the sink. I had brought enough supplies to last me through the weekend. Canned food, a camp stove, flashlight, spare batteries, matches, and a first aid kit. I wasn't trying to rough it, but I wanted quiet, and this place had it. After unpacking and settling in, I lit a lantern, cracked open a beer, and just sat on the steps outside, listening to nothing but trees rustling and the occasional snap of twigs from animals I couldn't see. That first night passed quietly. I slept well, bundled in layers with the fire keeping the room just warm enough. In the morning, I made instant coffee and walked around the property. The path led to a small creek with cold, clear water. I sat on a rock and watched it move around fallen branches. There was no sign of other people anywhere, not even trash or boot prints. It was one of the few times in my adult life I felt truly alone in a good way. Later that day, I decided to check out the shed. It had an old padlock, but the key had been left on a hook inside the cabin. The door creaked loudly when I pulled it open. Inside were the usual tools: an axe, handsaw, some rusty garden tools, a gas can, and what looked like a stack of old wooden crates pushed against the back wall. Nothing unusual. The air smelled like old wood and gasoline. I didn't spend long in there. That evening, I made a small fire outside and sat under the stars. There were so many stars. Without city lights, they looked like they were doubled in number. I ate a cold can of beans and sat quietly, watching the fire until it burned down. I felt content. That was probably the last moment I truly felt that way. It started with sounds, very faint at first. On the second night, as I was lying in bed, I heard what I thought was a branch snapping outside. Nothing unusual in the woods, so I ignored it. But then I heard it again. Not just a snap, but a deliberate crunch, like someone stepping on leaves. I sat up, turned off the lantern, and listened. For a while, it was completely quiet. Maybe it was a deer or a raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it sounded too heavy, too slow for an animal. I waited maybe 20 minutes, heart beating faster than I wanted to admit. Then it stopped. Whatever it was, I didn't hear it again that night. The next day, I tried to brush it off. Animals live in the woods. That's their home, not mine. I spent the day chopping some wood, exploring a bit further up the creek, and reading a book I'd brought. But I kept looking over my shoulder more than before. That night, I made sure everything was locked up tight. I checked the shed, closed the latch on the cabin door, and even wedged a chair under the knob. I lay in bed fully clothed with my flashlight on the pillow beside me. And again, I heard it, this time closer. Definitely footsteps, slow and spaced out, circling the cabin. I didn't move, just listened. They would stop for a long time, then start again like whoever or whatever it was standing still, waiting. At one point, they got so close I could hear leaves being pushed aside, almost like someone brushing against the wall of the cabin itself. I didn't sleep at all that night. When daylight came, I stepped outside cautiously, holding the axe I'd taken from the shed. There were faint marks in the ground, flattened patches of leaves, a few scuffed spots in the dirt, but nothing clear enough to say for sure what it was. Could have been my own tracks. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, then out toward the trees. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling that I was being watched had burrowed deep into my skin. I considered leaving that day. I had enough gas in the car, and my nerves were fried. But some dumb, stubborn part of me didn't want to feel like I had been chased away by nothing. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe it really was an animal and I was letting my imagination run wild. So I stayed, but I didn't relax. I kept the axe with me, stayed close to the cabin, and hardly touched the food I'd brought. Everything felt wrong. That night, I barely kept the fire going. I was too focused on the woods, flashlight in hand, scanning the trees over and over. I thought maybe I could scare off whatever it was just by showing I was alert. But just after midnight, something happened that pushed everything too far. There was a sound behind the shed, a solid thump, not a twig or a footstep. Something hit the side of it. I ran toward it without thinking, shining the light on the wall. Nothing. Then I swung the beam around and caught a figure in the corner of the light. Just a flash of a person, half hidden behind the trees. It was so quick, I almost convinced myself I hadn't seen it. But the shape was clear, upright, human-sized, moving fast. I yelled, even though I knew it was pointless. There was no answer, and they were gone. I didn't go back inside the cabin. I locked the door, sure, but I sat on the floor with my back to the wall, axe in my hands, flashlight off. I didn't want to give away my position. Every sound from the woods sounded like footsteps now. Every breeze that moved the trees made my muscles tense. It was a long, endless night, and when the sun finally came up, I was shaking from exhaustion and cold. I decided to leave immediately. I packed everything in less than 10 minutes, dumped what I didn't need in the trash barrel behind the cabin, and jumped in the car. But as I drove back down the dirt road, something made me stop. About a quarter mile from the cabin, I spotted something odd on the side of the road. A piece of red fabric, torn and tangled in a branch. I got out, heart pounding, and found that it was part of a flannel shirt, just hanging there, like someone brushed past it in a hurry. Not mine. I looked around, but there was no one. I got back in the car and didn't stop until I hit the main road hours later. Back in the city, everything felt loud again, but now it was a kind of comfort. I was surrounded by people, by noise, by light. I kept thinking about what I'd seen, the footsteps, the figure, the shirt. I hadn't imagined all of it. Someone had been out there, maybe watching me, maybe waiting for me to fall asleep, maybe just messing with me, but it was real. I filed a report with the local sheriff's office once I got home. I didn't expect them to find anything, and I doubt they even went up there. I never heard back. I haven't gone back to the woods since. I still take trips now and then, but never alone and never without cell service. I got rid of the axe too. I don't like the way it made me feel, sitting there with it in the dark, listening for someone who never came inside. What scares me most isn't what happened, though. It's what didn't. It's that whoever was out there never tried to break in, never spoke, never showed themselves fully. They didn't have to. They just let me know they were there. That was enough. That's what still keeps me up sometimes. Thinking about those woods, that shed, those footsteps, is how easily someone can become a part of your weekend without ever needing to say a word. I'd always wanted to get away from it all, to disconnect and find some peace in nature. That's how I ended up at a small, remote cabin in the woods of northern Michigan. It was early November, the kind of season where the air has a bite to it but the ground hasn't yet frozen solid. The leaves on the trees had already turned into shades of amber and gold, and the skies were often overcast, heavy with the impending promise of snow. My name is Ben Richards, and I was 29 years old when I decided to take this solo trip. My life in the city had become a bit too much to handle. The noise, the constant rush, the traffic, it all had a way of wearing me down. I thought that spending a week alone in a cabin would clear my mind, give me time to think. The cabin was an old place, tucked away deep in a forest, far from any signs of civilization. The nearest town was about 30 miles away, and the road leading up to the cabin was a narrow, unpaved trail that barely looked wide enough to fit my car. I had been following the directions I'd received online, but after a while, I started to wonder if I had made a wrong turn. The trees around me were dense, the kind that looked like they had been there for centuries, twisting their branches high above. The silence was almost suffocating. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under the tires and the occasional screech of a crow in the distance. I had my windows down, trying to take in the fresh, earthy scent of the forest, but that only seemed to make the quiet more intense. The deeper I drove, the more isolated I felt. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the cabin in the distance. It was small, one story, with a weathered wooden exterior that had clearly seen better days. It looked like something out of an old postcard. There was no electricity, no running water, just a small, rustic shelter in the woods. Perfect place to get away from it all. I parked my car, grabbed my bag, and walked up to the cabin. The front door was ajar, creaking slightly in the wind. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air inside the cabin smelled musty. Dust and the faint scent of mildew lingered in the corners. There was a single room with a fireplace on one wall, a small kitchen area to the right, and a rickety wooden table with mismatched chairs. A few items of old furniture were scattered around: a faded couch, a cracked coffee table, and a bed tucked away in the back corner. The walls were bare, except for a few framed photos of nature scenes, maybe placed there by the previous owners to make it feel homier. There was something eerie about the stillness of the place. I unpacked my things and started a fire in the hearth, the crackling flames providing the only warmth and light. The evening was fast approaching, and the chill of the forest outside began to creep in. I couldn't help but feel the isolation of the place. It was different from what I had imagined. More haunting, more empty. That night, I went to bed early. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, though the sheets felt a little rough. I tried to fall asleep, but my mind kept wandering. I had been looking forward to this solitude, but now that I was here, I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. The wind outside howled through the trees, and every so often, I would hear the creak of the wooden walls settling. My eyes kept darting to the windows, half expecting to see a figure standing outside, but nothing was there. The silence of the cabin pressed in around me, and I felt a rising unease in my chest. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a strange sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, a faint tapping, like something scratching at the walls. It was coming from the back corner of the cabin, near the window. My heart raced as I lay there in the dark, straining to listen. The noise continued for several seconds, then stopped abruptly. I lay still, holding my breath. My mind raced with all sorts of wild thoughts. Maybe it was an animal, perhaps a raccoon or something smaller that had found its way inside the walls. But no, it sounded too deliberate, like something was moving around just outside my reach. I grabbed my flashlight and slipped out of bed, my feet cold against the floorboards. I crept over to the window and peered outside, but there was nothing there. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, hidden just beyond the reach of the light, but I saw nothing. I returned to bed, trying to shake off the unease that had taken root in my chest. The rest of the night passed in fitful, uneasy sleep, with the occasional creak of the house and the distant howling of the wind. But nothing else disturbed me. The next morning, I woke up to a pale, gray light filtering in through the trees. I got dressed, made some coffee on the small stove, and sat down at the table to eat breakfast. The cabin was even colder than it had been the night before, and the silence was unnerving. It felt like the world outside was holding its breath. I spent the day walking around the area, trying to push the strange occurrences from my mind. The forest around the cabin was dense and beautiful. The leaves had mostly fallen by now, leaving the ground covered in a carpet of brown, crunching underfoot. I noticed a few animal tracks here and there. Deer, squirrels, maybe even a bear, but nothing that indicated any immediate danger. The woods were peaceful, if not a little too quiet. But as evening approached, the feeling of isolation grew heavier. The cabin was far from any road, and the thought of being so alone in the wilderness began to feel more and more unsettling. The idea that something or someone could be out there, just beyond the trees, watching me, it was hard to shake. That night, I decided to take some extra precautions. I locked the door, secured the windows, and piled extra firewood on the hearth. I had brought a small radio with me, hoping the noise would make the place feel a little less silent. But when I turned it on, all I could hear was static. It was the kind of eerie silence that made every small sound feel amplified. I lay in bed, my eyes flicking to the window every few seconds, but nothing was out of place. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I was woken by a loud banging sound. It was sharp and sudden, echoing through the cabin like a clap of thunder. My heart leaped in my chest, and I jumped out of bed, stumbling to the door. The noise had come from the back of the cabin again, the same place as the night before. I grabbed the flashlight and made my way over to the window. This time, I didn't hesitate. I opened the curtain and shined the beam of light out into the darkness. There was nothing there. The woods were still, the trees swaying gently in the wind, casting long shadows on the ground. I shone the light around, trying to make sense of what had happened, but there was nothing unusual, just the same silent, eerie landscape. I walked back to the bed, my pulse still racing. My thoughts were spinning. What was going on? What was making that noise? Was it something natural, or was I just letting my imagination run wild? I tried to go back to sleep, but the banging continued. It came in waves, first a thud, then a series of lighter taps, as if someone was trying to knock on the door, or something was scraping against the side of the cabin. The sounds were maddening, and my nerves were starting to fray. In a burst of frustration and fear, I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside. The air was colder now, biting against my skin as I made my way around the cabin, shining the flashlight along the walls, looking for anything that could explain the noise. My breath came in ragged bursts, visible in the pale light of the moon. But there was nothing, no sign of animals, no evidence of wind or rain that could be causing it. Just the same stillness that had been there when I first arrived. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, a shadow moving between the trees. My heart stopped. It was just a glimpse, a flash of movement, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what I had seen. Had someone been out there? Had I not been alone this whole time? I stood there for a long time, trying to steady my breath, trying to make sense of what I had seen. But the figure was gone now, swallowed by the darkness. The only sound was the wind through the trees. I rushed back inside, locking the door behind me. The cabin felt smaller, more confining now, as though it were closing in around me. I sat by the fire, my hands shaking as I tried to calm myself. The noise stopped after that as suddenly as it had started. The rest of the night passed in tense silence, with me lying in bed, wide awake, waiting for something else to happen. But it didn't. The night passed without any further disturbance. The next morning, I packed my things and left as early as I could. The feeling of dread still hung over me, the weight of the woods pressing on my chest. I didn't know what had happened, but I didn't want to stay to find out. The cabin had become something else, something strange and unsettling, and I had no intention of coming back. I drove away, leaving the cabin behind me, and didn't look back. Maybe it was just the isolation, the quiet, or the fact that I had been in a strange place for too long. But what I was 32 the summer I decided to take a week off from work and stay in a cabin outside Missoula, Montana. It was 2022, and I was burnt out from a string of back-to-back projects and needed to be somewhere without phone service or noise. I found a listing on a website that offered quiet, secluded places. The description said it was an off-grid cabin, 3 miles from the nearest paved road, surrounded by forest. The photos showed a basic wooden structure, small porch, propane stove, wood-burning heater, a table and a bed. No Wi-Fi, no plumbing. It was exactly what I wanted. I drove up in a rented Jeep on a Sunday morning. The directions were printed since I wasn't expecting signal once I got close. After turning off the highway, I followed a gravel road for nearly 20 minutes, then onto a rougher trail that twisted through pine trees and climbed in elevation. I had to go slow because of the deep ruts and rocks. It was past noon when I finally saw the cabin through the trees, sitting in a small clearing about 50 yards wide. The roof was steep and covered in dark metal sheets. A thin chimney stuck out of the top. There was a stack of wood against the sidewall and a blue barrel by the porch for collecting rainwater. It was quiet, the kind of silence that lets you hear your own breathing. The air smelled like pine and warm dirt. There were flies buzzing around the trees, but it wasn't too bad. I got out and stretched, then opened up the cabin. It was unlocked, just like the owner had said it would be. The inside was smaller than it looked in pictures, but clean. A small bed against one wall, a table and chair in the center, a stove in the corner, and some basic shelves with canned goods and matches. A cooler sat beside the door. No free. No lights except for a couple of battery-powered lanterns. I unpacked slowly, letting myself settle in. I brought enough food to last a week, mostly dry stuff and some fresh vegetables. There was a small outhouse maybe 50 feet into the trees, downhill from the cabin. The path to it was overgrown but still visible. That first night, I stayed up late on the porch, watching the sky turn dark. I had a fire going in the small fire pit a few steps from the cabin. I remember how quiet it was. I could hear the tiniest sounds, the wind shifting through leaves, a squirrel running across the roof, branches creaking somewhere out of sight. I fell asleep with the window cracked, the cool night air slowly drifting in. The first few days were peaceful. I went on short hikes during the day, following animal trails through the forest. I found an old logging road that led to a dry creek bed. I took photos of mushrooms, twisted roots, and the light breaking through the trees. I read in the afternoons and wrote in my notebook at night. By the third day, I stopped checking the time. My mind finally slowed down. It was on the fourth morning that I noticed something small and strange. When I went out to the rain barrel to wash my hands, I saw fresh scuff marks in the dirt around the porch. At first, I thought it was from me, but the shape looked different. The prints were longer and narrower than my boots, and there were 2 of them. They went toward the trees near the outhouse and disappeared into the undergrowth. I didn't think too much about it. Maybe it was a hunter or a local who wandered too close. That afternoon, I hiked west, trying to reach a rocky outcrop I had seen from the clearing. It took longer than expected, and I ended up turning back earlier than I wanted. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was already dipping below the trees. I was tired and didn't notice anything off at first. I cooked, wrote a bit, and went to sleep with the window still open a crack. The next morning, when I opened the door to get some water, I saw more prints in the dirt. A single line of them from the edge of the woods to the porch, then circling around the cabin. They were definitely not mine. They were spaced farther apart than a normal walk. No tire tracks, just those same long, narrow boot marks. I felt a chill in my chest, but I told myself again that it could be someone from town or another hiker who got curious. It was public land, after all. That night, I couldn't sleep as easily. I kept listening for footsteps or branches snapping. I had the lantern beside the bed, just in case. Around midnight, I finally dozed off. I woke up later to the sound of something tapping on the wall. Not loud, just a slow, steady tap. I froze. My heart started pounding immediately. I sat up and waited. The sound stopped. Then it started again, this time on the opposite side of the cabin, like someone was moving around. I didn't turn on the light. I just stayed still and listened. I couldn't see anything from the window. After a few minutes, the tapping stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, my ears tuned to every creak and sound in the woods. When morning came, I checked outside. More prints. This time, they went right up to the window. Whoever it was had stood there for a while. I saw the spot where the leaves were flattened near the glass. My stomach turned. I kept scanning the trees, but there was nothing. I considered leaving early, but something in me didn't want to panic. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was a kid messing around. Still, I decided to stay inside more that day and kept the hatchet beside me. That night, I barred the door using a piece of firewood wedged under the handle. I shut the windows completely. I didn't light the fire. I wanted it to look like I wasn't there. I laid in the dark, holding the hatchet, watching the window. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps outside, slow and careful. They came from the direction of the outhouse, stopped for a long time, then circled to the back. I didn't move. I held my breath. Something brushed against the wall again, lightly. Then I heard the faint sound of metal, a tool maybe scraping wood. The noise stopped after maybe 10 minutes. I stayed still for another hour before falling asleep from exhaustion. When the sun came up, I got up and checked the cabin again. The back corner had a fresh scrape in the wood near the bottom, deep, as if something sharp had been dragged across it. I packed my gear in 15 minutes. I was done. I didn't see anyone on my way back to the Jeep. I kept looking over my shoulder. At one point, I thought I heard someone breathing behind a tree, but it could have been the wind. I got into the Jeep and started the engine without even checking my map. I followed the trail back to the gravel road and drove until I had cell service. When I stopped at a diner outside town, I sat there for 20 minutes before going inside. My hands were still shaking a little. I didn't call the police. I didn't tell anyone except my brother when I got home. He laughed, said I'd scared myself in the woods. But I know what I heard. I know someone was out there. Someone who never said a word, never knocked, never left a note. Just walked through the forest, night after night, getting closer and closer. I didn't go back to the woods after that. I canceled another cabin trip I had booked later that year. Even now, years later, I think about that tapping, about the footprints, about how someone could live out there, just beyond the edge of silence, watching. What still bothers me most is the realization that they never tried to get in. Not really. They could have. The door was thin, the window easy to break, but they didn't. They just wanted to let me know they were there. Every night, closer. The scariest part wasn't what they did. It was what they didn't do. I was 37 when I decided to take a break from everything. The year was 2019, and I had just gone through a messy divorce that drained me emotionally and financially. I lived in a small town near Omaha, Nebraska, and worked as a logistics coordinator for a regional shipping company. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well enough. I didn't have kids, and I wasn't close with my family, so when things fell apart, it felt like there was no one left around me. I needed space. Time away from people, screens, traffic, expectations, all of it. I didn't want to find myself or go on some emotional journey. I just wanted to be alone. A friend of a friend had a small hunting cabin about 4 hours northwest, near the edge of the Niobrara Valley. It was deep in the woods, up a long gravel road with no neighbors nearby. It had no Wi-Fi, barely any cell service, and ran on solar and propane. He said I could use it for free if I just cleaned up after myself. I didn't hesitate. I packed up my truck, bought some groceries, brought along a few books and notebooks, and headed out. The drive was long, flat, and mostly uneventful. I stopped in a small town for gas and to grab a few last-minute things, then turned off the highway onto a dirt road that seemed to go on forever. The sun was low by the time I reached the cabin. It was a simple, one-story structure with a tin roof and dark wood siding. There was a small porch out front, and the windows were dusty but intact. A pile of chopped firewood sat near the door, and there was a propane tank behind the building. Inside, it was basic. One main room with a twin bed, a wood stove, a table and chair, and a small kitchenette. There was a tiny bathroom with a composting toilet and a gravity-fed sink. The windows had no curtains. It wasn't cozy, but it was what I wanted: solitude. That first night, I didn't do much. I made a can of soup on the little propane burner, read a few chapters of a book, and went to bed early. I left the windows open because it was still warm outside, and the sounds of the woods were loud: bugs, owls, and distant rustling. It took me a while to fall asleep. The mattress was thin, and every creak of the wooden walls seemed amplified in the silence. But I was tired from the drive and eventually drifted off. The next few days were calm. I got up early, made coffee, sat outside on the porch, and watched the light change through the trees. I went on long walks, sometimes just following deer trails into the forest until I got tired. I wrote a few pages in a notebook each day, nothing deep, mostly just observations and random thoughts. I started to relax. My shoulders didn't feel as tight. My breathing slowed. I didn't think about work or my ex or anything beyond what I was going to eat or whether it might rain. But around the fourth day, things started to feel a little off. It began with small things. One morning, I found a set of footprints in the dirt near the woodpile. At first, I thought they were mine, but the size didn't match. These were longer and narrower, and I hadn't been out that early. They pointed toward the back of the cabin but didn't circle around. I stood there for a long time just looking at them. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone just passing through. But there were no other cabins nearby, and it was private land. Later that day, I walked around the cabin and checked all the doors and windows. Everything was locked. Nothing seemed touched. Still, I moved the woodpile a little closer to the porch, just so I could see if it was disturbed again. That night, I kept the windows closed and latched. I didn't sleep as well. The next morning, the footprints were gone, washed away by dew or wind, but the feeling stayed with me. I tried to shake it off. I made a longer hike that day, down a small slope where a creek ran through a narrow valley. The water was low and clear. I sat on a rock and ate an apple and listened to the water for what felt like an hour. It helped. I felt a little more grounded again. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but the unease returned quickly. That evening, I noticed that the axe I kept by the woodpile was missing. It had been leaning against the cabin wall. I searched around, thinking maybe it had fallen over or rolled down the slight incline behind the porch, but it was just gone. I hadn't moved it, and there was no wind strong enough to knock it away. I walked a full circle around the cabin with a flashlight, but I didn't see any signs of anyone. Still, I locked the door tight that night and put a chair against it. I didn't have a gun, just a small knife I used for cooking and a rusty hammer I found in a drawer. I kept both next to the bed. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept hearing noises, twigs snapping, faint crunches in the underbrush. Could have been animals. Probably was. But every little sound seemed deliberate. I stayed still in the dark and stared at the ceiling, counting the seconds between each noise. At one point, I thought I heard something brush against the side of the cabin. Not a knock, more like a scrape. Then nothing. The next morning, I went outside as soon as it was light. The axe was back, leaning against the cabin wall exactly where I had left it originally. I froze when I saw it. My stomach dropped. Someone had been there. Someone had taken it and someone had brought it back. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was someone. I didn't want to panic. I stood there staring at the axe for a long time before picking it up and taking it inside. I thought about leaving, but part of me didn't want to give in to fear. Maybe it was just a messed up prank. Maybe someone else knew about the cabin and thought it would be funny to mess with me. I didn't want to look paranoid or weak, so I stayed. But I changed my habits. I started keeping the axe inside. I kept all the windows locked. I moved the small table in front of the door at night. I stopped walking far from the cabin. I began to notice small changes, nothing huge, just tiny things. A rock placed on the porch that hadn't been there before. A small bundle of twigs tied with a bit of twine near the steps. The smell of wood smoke in the air even though I hadn't lit the stove. Then, 2 nights later, I woke up at around 3 a.m. to a faint sound. Something moving just outside the wall near my head. I held my breath and listened. It was a slow, steady sound. Footsteps in the leaves, circling the cabin. They moved carefully, not rushed. I waited in the dark, gripping the axe with both hands. The footsteps stopped at the front of the cabin. Then nothing. I didn't hear anything else for the rest of the night. I didn't sleep again. In the morning, I found something new. A small, half-burned candle was sitting on the porch railing. It hadn't been there before. It wasn't mine. I hadn't brought any candles. It looked like the kind used for emergencies, white, stubby, cheap. Someone had left it there, placed deliberately. I picked it up with a towel, not wanting to touch it directly, and threw it into the woods as far as I could. That afternoon, I made the decision to leave. I couldn't take it anymore. The fear wasn't just in my head. Someone was out there, and they weren't just passing through. They were watching me. They had been coming back, each night, getting closer, leaving things. Felt like a game, and I didn't want to know what came next. I packed quickly. I threw everything into my truck, didn't bother cleaning up. I was just about to lock the door behind me when I noticed a new footprint near the porch, deeper than the others. It was fresh. I didn't wait. I got in the truck and drove, faster than I should have, bouncing over potholes and ruts. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. I didn't go back to Omaha. I stayed with a friend in Kansas City for a few weeks. I didn't tell him the whole story, just that I needed time. When I finally returned home, I sold most of my things, moved to a different part of the city, and never contacted the guy who lent me the cabin. I don't even remember his name now. It's been years since that happened, and I still think about it. Not every day, but often enough. I still don't know who it was. A local squatter? Some hunter playing games? Someone else who thought the cabin was theirs? I don't know. I never filed a report. What would I say? No one got hurt. Nothing was stolen. But someone was there, and they were trying to scare me. And it worked. I don't go camping anymore. I don't go out to the woods at all. I lock my doors every night, double-check my windows. I even installed cameras around my apartment. Not that I think it'll help much. I guess the scariest part wasn't that someone was out there. It's that they never needed to break in. They were always outside, just close enough to remind me that I was never really alone. And I'll never forget that feeling. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, far enough away from anything to feel isolated, but close enough to civilization that I could get there without too much trouble. I had rented it out for the weekend, hoping for some peace and quiet. It was early October, and the crisp, cool air hinted at the coming of winter. The trees had just begun to change, and the woods were full of that earthy, damp smell that comes when the leaves are turning. I arrived at the cabin around midday, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. The place looked exactly like I'd expected. Old, weather-beaten wood, moss creeping up the sides, and a rusted metal chimney. It wasn't fancy, but that was part of the appeal. It was simple, a place to escape. I grabbed my backpack from the car and walked up to the front door, a bit nervous but mostly excited. The inside was even more rustic than I thought. There was a stone fireplace along one wall, a couple of worn-out couches that had seen better days, and a small kitchen tucked into the back. The floors creaked underfoot, the wood soft and groaning as I moved around. There was a small window above the kitchen sink that looked out into the woods. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, but there was something comforting about it. I made myself comfortable, unpacking my things and setting up in one of the small bedrooms. It had a big, wooden bed with an old quilt draped over it. The walls were lined with shelves filled with books and dusty old trinkets. I wasn't sure when this place had last been updated, but it didn't matter. It was perfect. That evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, looking out at the darkening woods. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, maybe too peaceful. There was a quiet unease settling in my stomach, but I shrugged it off, figuring it was just the isolation getting to me. As the night went on, the air grew colder. I was bundled up in a jacket, but I could still feel the chill in my bones. I went inside to warm up, lighting the fireplace and curling up on one of the couches with a book. The fire crackled and popped, filling the cabin with warmth. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. It sounded like it was going to storm, and I was glad to be inside, where it was safe and dry. Around midnight, I started to hear strange noises coming from outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, maybe branches scraping against the side of the cabin. But then the noises became more distinct. Soft thuds like something or someone was walking around outside. My heart began to race. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the noise didn't stop. It came closer and closer until I could hear something or someone moving around just outside the window. I tried to ignore it, pulling the blanket tighter around me, but the sounds continued. I stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. There was nothing there, just the thick forest stretching out as far as I could see. I felt foolish standing there, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. I checked the door, making sure it was locked. Everything seemed fine. I went back to the couch, trying to shake off the tension that had built up in my chest. The fire crackled in the hearth, the only sound now. But then, just as I was beginning to relax again, there was a loud bang at the door. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. I waited, listening for any further sound. Nothing came. I slowly stood up, moving cautiously toward the door. My hand was shaking as I reached for the handle, but I didn't open it. I could feel my breath coming faster, the air suddenly thick with fear. There was no one there. I took a step back, still staring at the door. The feeling of being watched washed over me again. Stronger now. I knew I wasn't imagining it. Something was out there. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what could be going on. Could be someone playing a prank, but who would come all the way out here to mess with me? There were no other houses nearby, no neighbors for miles. It didn't make sense. The wind had died down now, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. Eventually, I forced myself to go to bed, though sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle outside, had me wide awake, listening for any sign of movement. The next morning, I was exhausted. I made a quick breakfast of eggs and toast, my mind still reeling from the strange events of the night before. I decided to go for a walk to clear my head, hoping the fresh air would help. As I stepped outside, the morning sun had already begun to warm the air, and the woods were bathed in a soft, golden light. It was beautiful, but the beauty felt hollow somehow. I wandered down a small trail that led deeper into the forest. The trees were tall and thick, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. I kept walking, trying to shake off the lingering feeling of dread. The further I went, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of the woods, birdsong, rustling leaves, seemed to have disappeared. All I could hear was the sound of my own footsteps crunching on the dry leaves beneath my feet. As I walked, I noticed something odd. The trail had become overgrown, as though it hadn't been used in years. The more I looked around, the more I realized that the woods here felt different. The trees were taller, the underbrush thicker. I had wandered off the main path without realizing it. I had no idea how far I had gone, and for the first time, I started to feel uneasy about being so far from the cabin. I turned around to head back, but the trail I had been following seemed to have disappeared. The trees were denser now, the branches intertwined above me like a canopy. I couldn't see the cabin or any sign of the main trail. Panic began to set in. I started walking faster, but everything around me looked the same, just more trees and thick underbrush. My mind raced as I tried to remember which way I had come from, but nothing made sense. After what felt like hours, I stumbled across a small clearing. There, in the middle of the clearing, was a rundown cabin. It wasn't the one I had rented, but it looked eerily similar. The wood was rotting, the windows boarded up. It had clearly been abandoned for years. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached it. I had to know if someone else had been here, if they were the ones who had been messing with me. I reached the door and pushed it open, the old hinges creaking in protest. Inside, everything was covered in dust and cobwebs. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. There was a small wood stove in the corner, the rusted remains of what might have once been a chair, and a few broken pieces of furniture scattered around the room. But what caught my eye was the small table near the window. There were pieces of paper scattered across it, as though someone had been writing or drawing something before they left. I picked up one of the papers, the edges torn and yellowed with age. The writing was scribbled, hurried, almost frantic. It was hard to make out, but the words "leave now" were clear. My heart skipped a beat, felt like a warning. I dropped the paper and backed away from the table, my mind racing. I didn't belong here. I didn't know what had happened in this cabin, but something about it felt wrong. I turned and ran out of the cabin, the fear bubbling up inside me. I needed to get back to my own cabin. I needed to get out of the woods. I didn't stop running until I finally saw the familiar outline of the cabin in the distance. I didn't look back. When I got back to the cabin, I locked every door and window, double-checking them to make sure they were secure. I didn't feel safe anymore. Whatever had been out there, whoever had been out there, had been trying to send me a message. I didn't know what it meant, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I spent the rest of the day indoors, too scared to leave. The sun began to set, and the cabin grew darker, colder. I kept thinking about that abandoned cabin, about the note. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. But nothing else happened that night. The noises from outside stopped, and the silence that followed was almost peaceful. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't even stay for breakfast. I just wanted to get out of the woods. As I drove away, I looked back at the cabin one last time. It sat there, still and silent, hidden deep in the forest. I didn't know what had happened or who or what had been out there, but I was glad to be leaving. I had come to the woods for peace and quiet, but I had found something else, something I couldn't explain, something I never wanted to experience again. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth as I trudged up the narrow dirt path. My boots crunched against the fallen needles, each step drawing me closer to the cabin I had rented for the weekend. It wasn't much, but that was exactly what I was looking for. A place to escape, to clear my head. It had been a long year, filled with work stress, personal chaos, and a lot of unanswered questions. A weekend in the woods, with nothing but the company of the trees, seemed like the perfect remedy. The cabin stood at the edge of a small clearing, nestled between towering trees, its wooden exterior weathered from years of exposure. The roof sagged slightly, the paint peeling in places, giving the building a worn but charming look. There were no neighbors for miles, just miles and miles of forest stretching in every direction. It was exactly the kind of isolation I needed. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The wooden floor creaked beneath my weight, and I could hear the sound of my breathing echo in the empty space. It was a simple cabin. One room, a small kitchen tucked in the corner, a few mismatched chairs, a wood-burning stove, and a large window that looked out over the forest. The furniture was basic, but it would do. I could already imagine sitting by the fire, reading a book, maybe taking a nap after a long hike. The peace I was searching for was finally within reach. After unpacking my things and lighting a fire in the stove, I decided to take a walk around the area. It was late afternoon, and the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air was cool but not cold, and the sky had that amber glow that you only get in the hours before sunset. The forest around me seemed almost alive, the trees shifting gently in the breeze, their branches creaking like old bones. I walked for hours, slowly making my way through the thick woods. I wasn't in any rush, just letting my feet carry me where they would. There was something calming about the forest, the way everything seemed so still, so undisturbed. The sounds of birds and insects filled the air. The rustling of leaves beneath my feet was the only sign that anything was moving. It was the kind of quiet that felt almost sacred, like I was walking through a place that had been untouched for centuries. As the light began to fade, I turned back toward the cabin. The walk had been longer than I intended, and I didn't want to be caught out here when the darkness fully set in. The woods, while beautiful, had an eerie feel once the sun went down. The trees took on a more ominous shape in the fading light, their long shadows stretching out like dark fingers reaching across the ground. When I returned to the cabin, I locked the door behind me and settled in for the night. The fire was still crackling in the stove, its warmth radiating through the small room. I made myself a simple dinner of canned soup and some crackers, eating slowly as I listened to the occasional pop of the firewood. The cabin felt cozy, almost intimate, and I could feel the tension from the outside world beginning to melt away. But then, around midnight, something changed. At first, it was subtle, just a small sound, a slight shift in the air. I couldn't place it, but it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I sat still for a moment, listening. There it was again, a soft thud, followed by the sound of something scraping against the wooden floor, came from the far side of the cabin, near the window. My heart skipped a beat. The house was small, far too small for any kind of animal to get in without me noticing. I got up from my chair and walked quietly toward the window. The night outside was pitch black, but I could make out the silhouette of the trees swaying in the breeze. No movement, nothing out of the ordinary. I stood there for a moment, staring into the dark forest, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Maybe it was just the house settling, or the wind moving something against the wall. It was an old cabin, after all. But deep down, something didn't feel right. There was a heaviness in the air, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I shrugged off the uneasy feeling and decided to go to bed. I turned off the lights and crawled under the thick wool blankets, trying to ignore the knot of discomfort twisting in my stomach. The fire had burned low, and the only sound now was the occasional creak of the floorboards as the house shifted with the cold. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept wandering back to the noise I'd heard. The thud, the scraping sound. It felt like it had come from inside the cabin, not from the outside. Maybe it was just an animal, something small like a raccoon rummaging around. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The silence of the cabin seemed too thick, like it was pressing in on me. Around 2 a.m., I finally gave up on sleep. I got out of bed and pulled on my boots. The cold night air hit me like a slap as I opened the door and stepped outside onto the porch. I stood there for a moment, staring into the inky blackness of the forest. Nothing moved. The air was still, and all I could hear was the sound of my breath in the quiet night. I walked around the perimeter of the cabin, shining the flashlight along the ground. There was nothing out of place, no signs of animals or people, but still that feeling lingered. It was like the forest was watching me, waiting. After another hour, I gave up my search and returned to the cabin. The tension in my chest was growing, but I couldn't put my finger on why. There was nothing to explain it. The cabin was isolated, the door was locked, and everything appeared normal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next day, I woke up to a bright, crisp morning. The sun was shining through the trees, casting dappled light on the forest floor. The air was fresh, and the world seemed peaceful again. I decided to go for another hike to clear my head, hoping that the events of the previous night were just my imagination. But as I walked deeper into the woods, I began to notice things that I hadn't seen before. Small marks on the trees, like someone had carved into the bark. I followed them for a while, but they seemed to lead in circles, never getting any closer to anything. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up again, but I pushed the feeling aside. It was just a coincidence, I told myself. Nothing more. I spent the rest of the day wandering the forest, trying to focus on the beauty around me. By evening, I was back at the cabin, and I tried to relax in front of the fire. But no matter how much I told myself to calm down, I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. The cabin felt colder now, emptier. The silence was oppressive, and every little noise seemed amplified. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the sound again. The thud, the scraping. It was closer this time, right outside my window. I shot up in bed, my heart racing. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it out the window, but there was nothing there. No animal, no person, just the dark forest. I was starting to lose my grip on reality. My mind was playing tricks on me, or so I thought. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here another night. The next morning, I packed up my things, my hands shaking as I stuffed my clothes into my bag. I had no reason to feel so terrified, but I couldn't ignore the overwhelming sense that something was wrong. I locked up the cabin, grabbed my keys, and left, driving back down the dirt path toward the nearest town. When I finally reached a small cafe, I stopped to grab some coffee and calm down. I overheard a conversation between two locals, an older man and a woman, about the cabin I had stayed in. The man spoke of the place in hushed tones, saying that strange things had happened there over the years. People had come and gone, but none had stayed for long. They talked about the woods, how they had a way of messing with your mind. I didn't stay to hear more. Couldn't. It didn't matter anymore. I was safe and I had no intention of ever going back. As I drove away, I looked back one last time at the forest. It was beautiful, silent, but I knew I was never going back there. Some things are better left unexplored.